Alrighty, so settler colonialism and the revolution, 1692 to 1783 is sort of the second unit in WAMS. Lost my mouse, there we go. For the purposes, so it's divided into two sections. Each section in each unit in WAMS is divided into subsections. In this case, we've divided it into two. So settler colonialism is a look at the sort of later colonial period and different colonial enterprises shifting toward this settler colonialism model. It's less about extracting resources and more about settling and conquering this land, peopling the land. We don't have time to really dig into that today, but I encourage you to take a look. We cover a huge swath of geography in that unit, from the American South to Alaska to the American West. So please do dig into that. And then today we are going to be focused on the American Revolution section of this unit. And so to get us thinking, get us in the mindset of this period, again, let's just put in the chat, what comes to mind when you think of women in the revolution? What are sort of those knee-jerk things that either you think of or your students think of when we think about the American Revolution and women? Betsy Ross, excellent, Mike. Thank Michael. I don't know if you're a Mike or a Michael. Thank you, Michael. Nurses, spies, excellent. Remember the ladies, Abigail Adams. Supporting roles of women, wonderful, excellent. Anything else? Support roles, hardworking camp followers, yes, excellent. Okay. So yeah, these are sort of the marquee people and roles, shall we say, that come up in sort of a traditional US history textbook, perhaps. So we're going to look at a handful of resources that corroborate and complicate these stories that are perhaps a little bit more familiar to us. So as we march through our session together, these are the essential questions. Whoops, sorry about that. And these are taken directly from this section of WAMS. So these are on the WAMS website. Here's what we're going to be thinking about as we go forward. Number one, how did women actively participate in the revolutionary era? How were women's activities in this era circumscribed by social and legal limitations? What effect did a woman's race, class, or social differences have on her experience of the revolutionary era? And why are women's stories critical to understanding the events of the American Revolution? So, number one, we will be sort of discussing and unpacking these in the breakout rooms in half an hour, 40 minutes from now or so. So they will come back after we go through this section. But, you know, as I hope you can see here, we are trying to accomplish sort of two complementary goals in WAMS in each unit, which is number one, to think about how we can, as I said, incorporate women's roles, perspectives, contributions in the traditional US history narrative that we know teachers sort of have to cover, have to march through. So we know that folks have to teach about slavery in the American Revolution. So let's use some women as examples of that so we can sort of check multiple boxes. So that's an important piece of this. But we also think it's important and worthwhile as much as possible to carve out a small amount of space in the classroom to talk about women's history specifically. And so with these essential questions, we're trying to sort of get at both of those things, and you'll see it come out in the sources we are about to look at. Okie doke. So we're going to start here with this resource. As I'm going to read this aloud, and as we read, I would like you to consider what this document reveals about the legal status of women in the British colonies, sort of getting at one of those essential questions. As we read, what does this document reveal about the legal status of women in the British colonies? All right, so it says, by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything, and is, under the protection and influence of her husband, her baron or lord, and her condition during her marriage is called her coverture. Upon this principle of a union of person in husband and wife depend almost all the legal rights, duties, and disabilities that either of them acquire by the marriage. Even the disabilities which the wife lies under are for the most part intended for her protection and benefit. So great a favorite is the female sex of the laws of England. Ooh, boy. So before we dive in and start sort of unpacking that, I do want to just point out, so we have the document text on the left-hand side here, and then we have a summary. So this is something that we do in WAMS. Anytime we're presenting a primary source document, we present the original text where we have a photo of the original physical thing. We include that as well, but we do a transcription of the original text and then a side-by-side summary of that text. And our thought here is that we want learners to be able to access the information contained in a primary source document, even if perhaps the language is a little bit too challenging, perhaps they're a struggling reader. By providing that summary piece, it helps them sort of unpack it, and also to a degree models what it means to read a primary source and think about it in our own words. Teachers have the option to print the resource without that summary text if they prefer to just give the students the original primary source document, but we do always provide both. All right, so as we were reading this text, we were thinking about, what does this document reveal about the legal status of women in the British colonies? So I'm going to put the text back up, and you can put into the chat some ideas that you might have. What does this document reveal about what it meant to be a woman and a woman's place in British life, in British society? What do we think? All right, excellent. Women are helpless creatures, Mitch. Yeah, women are helpless creatures. They need male protection, and isn't England so kind for providing that to them legally? Yes, a woman is defined by her husband. She ceases to exist. Excellent. They're not a separate being. Women are inferior, perpetually have the status of children. Excellent, Christine. Women had no legal status. Yeah, so under coverture, women do not legally exist. They are covered by their husbands, and then before that, their fathers. It gets a little hairier when women choose to remain single through adulthood and or are widowed, but women's lives are very circumscribed by this piece of English common law. And our friend that we have here, Sir William Blackstone, was an English judge and jurist who did not come up with coverture or any piece of English common law, but he was among the first to write it down. And in writing it down, he codified it in a meaningful way. By putting it in writing, it became more formal and concrete. So let's think about a couple of other things. How would coverture shape women and girls, how they were perceived and treated by society? What is the existence of coverture? How might that shape a woman's life and experience in society? What do we think? Yeah, Terry, oh, it's going fast, yeah. Terry, yeah, we don't need to, they don't have value, we don't need to pay attention to them. They need protection, they are dependent, they are inherently dependent, right? Excuse me. They're invisible. Marriage is the most important thing, says Peggy. Yeah, would not have expended a lot of resources to educate them in most cases. Yeah, because why bother? They will be covered by their husband. Their husband will protect them. Their husband will represent them. Their husband will manage them. And that's exactly true. Most girls were not educated in the under coverture and in the English colonies, especially, because it didn't seem necessary. And, you know, it also sort of it reinforced these stereotypes about women, justification for their second-class treatment, that they were dependent, that they're weak, that they're unintelligent. Yeah, Terry, it makes it easy to ignore their voices, right? Visualization of suppression. Yes, I love that. So yeah, girls didn't really receive much education. They lacked the preparation and therefore also the confidence to try to go pursue a profession or an independent life. not for lack of potential ability or desire, but because society was built in a way that really prevented them from doing that. Didn't mean some people didn't, but it was just very hard. And how would it affect their ability to participate in the issues and debates of the American Revolution? If we're thinking in this session about the revolution itself, how would coverture play out in a woman's ability to actively participate in that very political sphere, moment? What do we think? Heather, yes, excellent. Backseat at best, maybe not even in the car. Influence it in a subtle way, yes. Sort of through their husbands, use their feminine wiles, right, to convince their husbands of their perspectives, perhaps. Yeah, so it, to me, it tells us, in some cases at least, women were subscribed or restricted to certain roles, some of which we saw in your initial ideas about what roles women play in the revolution. But again, that's not necessarily by choice. They're not non-actors by choice. They were legally beholden to their fathers, to their husbands, and therefore to their politics. So they had to find these creative ways to participate that were either sort of covert or deemed acceptable by society because they're staying in sort of the feminine sphere, or in some cases just throw all that aside, cast it aside, and risk everything. And some of these women did. So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at this resource. And I know I sent around in advance a couple of the sources, so if you've read these already, that's great. So we're gonna zoom in on one section of this newspaper resource from the Virginia Gazette. We'll be looking specifically at the little spot with that I've just thrown the orange box around. And we're gonna read this text. And as we read this, we do another read aloud. I want you to consider, what are the women saying in this statement? And why do we think they felt the need to publish it? They published this in the newspaper. So what are they saying, and why do we think maybe they felt the need to publish it? So as I read, feel free to be putting things in the chat as we go. All right, so this is from Edenton, North Carolina, October 25th, 1774. As we cannot be indifferent on any occasion that appears nearly to affect the peace and happiness of our country, and as it has been thought necessary for the public good to enter into several particular resolves by a meeting of members deputed from the whole province, it is a duty which we owe, not only to our near and dear connections who have concurred in them, but to ourselves, who are essentially interested in their welfare, to do everything as far as lies in our power to testify our sincere adherence to the same. And we do therefore accordingly subscribe this paper as a witness of our fixed intention and solemn determination to do so. And then quite a long list of names. So this is Edenton, North Carolina. This is 1774. So what are the women saying here? Notice all the names attached to it are women. What are the women saying here? And why do they feel the need to publish this sort of manifesto? What do we think? Heather says we need to have a voice and input. We care about the outcome of this. Excellent. Anything else? Stephanie says solidarity. Excellent. Women and moral authority. Okay, I love that, Liana. Yes. Peggy's saying almost like a warning of what may come. Interesting. Because if it is first one voice, it will not be heard. Yes, so sort of strength in numbers, power in numbers by having all of their names assigned to it. Yeah, so thinking about why would they feel the need to publish this? They can talk about it amongst themselves, and that doesn't really do much, right? Nobody is going to pay a lot of attention to a group of women sitting around and having tea and talking to each other. But by publishing it, they are making it public. They are making their voices heard, and they're taking a very clear political stand. And what are they saying? What stand is that? What's the point here? Sarah says, women's duty is to promote this point of view. Okay, yeah, so they're saying we understand that this is happening, this crazy shenanigans, right? This is early. Nobody would have necessarily called it the American Revolution yet, but all of these political uprisings are sort of starting to happen. This is 1774, so the Tea Act happens in 1773. The Boston Tea Party happens just a few months before this. So they're like, we're aware, we see what's going on. It's our duty to support their near and dear connections. Excellent, Kurt. So let's see what my next question here is on the slide. Hey, yay, Kurt, you anticipated. So who are their near and dear connections who have concurred? And why do they reference these people? They're saying, all right, where is it? Is a duty which we owe not only to our near and dear connections who have concurred in them, but to ourselves, who are essentially interested in their welfare. Yeah, their near and dear connections are the family men, right? The husbands, the fathers, right? On whose livelihoods these women's lives depend, right? So these men, these women's husbands, fathers are pro-revolution. And these women say, we know it's happening, we support it too, but it's also sort of a nod to coverture. If this doesn't go well, if their livelihoods are lost in the midst of all of this, these women will have very little recourse. They'll have very little way to support themselves without the income and coverture, the political cover of their husbands, but also they fall under the political cover of their husbands. So legally, their husbands' political causes are their political causes. But these women are taking it a step further and publishing that they agree, that they are not just meek hangers-on, for lack of a better word, but they are engaged in these politics as well. And then in what ways does this statement support perceptions of women at the time? And in what ways are these women acting against what's expected of them? So thinking about the context of coverture, how are these women finding ways to participate within those restrictions? And then where are maybe they pushing the boundaries a little bit? What do we think? Peggy says, I wonder how their husbands felt when their wives published this and put their names out there. Yeah, excellent, Peggy. That's such a good point. Not only did these women publish this paragraph, but they signed all of their names. They signed their full names, first and last. And interestingly, they used their first names. They weren't, let's see. So it's Abigail Charlton. It's not Mrs. John Charlton, it's Abigail Charlton. So they're sort of asserting their personhood in a real way by signing their own full names. So Liana says, if coverture states that men and women are one, perhaps these women took that at face value, giving them a voice. Great. Lori, women see and are fed up with, probably had the blessings of the hubby. Yeah, in most, it is very likely that the husbands of these women knew they were doing this and we're okay with it. And they sort of couch it that way, right? In the document itself, they say, we owe a duty to these men and to our country, and we support it, right? If coverture states that men and women are one, perhaps these women took that at face value. Yeah, excellent. Alrighty, so as we said, the Boston Tea Party is just a few months earlier, so that's December 1773. We're now in October 1774. So women had been participating in the tea boycott for a long time already. We know that that was one way that women were sort of safe to participate in the actions of the revolution, by boycotting. Women sort of control the household's pocketbooks very often, but here these women are taking it a step further by publishing this in the newspaper. And this is the first time in the history of the British colonies that women came together to make a public political declaration. And it went far beyond the community of Edenton, North Carolina. It was republished in newspapers all over the colonies and England. And there were strong reactions, as one might expect, from both sides who read it. But these women took it upon themselves to get this published, and that makes it all the more remarkable. So, because we do know too that there were women publishing and participating sort of in the written word of the revolution, but it was very common for them to publish under pseudonyms. For example, Mercy Otis Warren. So that these women signed their full names is really a remarkable stand. But as I said, this traveled the world. People saw it. People had feelings about it. Let's take a look at this political cartoon, which was published shortly thereafter in England in response to this, what I keep calling a manifesto is probably not the right term for it, but nevertheless, we're going to take a look at this, and we're going to use this sort of a three-step process to analyze this image. First is observation. So observation is just, what do you see? What do you notice? If we could, if this was, you know, the olden days and we had pen and paper, what would you circle on this image? What are some details that stand out to you? And then we'll do interpretations. What do these details tell us about this source? And then inferences. Taken together, these observations, these interpretations, what does this image teach us about the topic? So let's start with some observations. Go ahead and put in the chat, what are some things you see? What do you notice when you look at this image? All right, we got the baby on the floor being licked by the dog. Great. Yeah, the women are they're depicted in an unflattering way. Yes, that's a good way to put it, Michael. Yes, Heather says a man sexually assaulting the writer. Yes, I don't think they would have used that language at the time, but to our eyes, yeah, he is all up in her business, and it's problematic for sure. There's a black woman in the background here. Excellent. Anything else that we notice? Is the dog peeing? The dog is definitely peeing. And these boxes with the cap on them, these are tea caddies. So the dog is peeing on a tea caddy. Women involved in politics are battle axes. Yes, I love this, Mitch. Meek, unmarried, good-looking women are there to flirt with the men. Yeah, the women who are, this woman here who's holding the gavel maybe wouldn't be described as meek. She's not terribly flirtatious, but she's wielding the power, and therefore she's a threat. And so we're gonna portray her as perhaps undesirable physically. And the men are being depicted as weak. Yeah, excellent. So they're sort of being pushed aside. They're in the background. Here we have, this is a punch bowl. So this is alcohol. People are drinking in large amounts here in this image. We have this woman in the background pouring tea into this man's hat. Yeah, so we're sort of jumping ahead to these interpretations and these inferences, which is great. So women are taking important roles, but the men don't look super happy. Yeah, Heather, society has unraveled, right? So this is threatening. This is, not only are the colonists pushing back against their colonial power, the British government, the British crown, but also suddenly women are participating in politics. Like, maybe this is a bridge too far. Society is really starting to unravel. I love this image because it's, you know, we could unpack it for a long time, but it's a great complement to the physical piece that these women wrote. And I think a great activity that I always recommend, that I've done with folks in the past, but in the pre-virtual world, virtual workshops don't lend themselves as well to this kind of activity. But what you could do with students is, you know, you read the piece from the newspaper, analyze it, take a look at this cartoon, unpack it, and then have them create a political cartoon from the perspective of the women who wrote the Edenton Tea Party piece, or people who supported them, or people who supported the revolution generally. Trump supporter critic too. Peggy says maybe that women are taking on new roles but are still stuck with their old roles, right? So they're pushing forward one step at a time, but you can't leapfrog all the way to the end. It's incremental change. And I mean, it's such a cliche to say, but very often in US history, and particularly in women's history, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Every time a woman steps into a new sphere, got to walk it back for a little while. We need the trailblazer, then there's pushback, and then we can continue. down that path. Mitch says, American women are ignoring their wifely, motherly duties to take part in politics. Yeah, so it's a real criticism of these women. Nobody's taking care of this baby. It's getting licked by the dogs. We don't know if this man is this woman's husband. Is she an adulteress? We don't know. So their morality is called into question. And in so doing, their womanhood, and in so doing, their very being is called into question because they dared to take this step of publishing their names with this political cause in the newspaper. All right, so what does all of this reveal about English attitudes towards women and towards the Revolutionary War? Well, it's not the war yet, but towards the Revolution. What do we think? I see S. Harrison, I don't know what your first name is, I'm sorry, earlier said London sees the colonies as being backward and in chaos. Good, excellent. Heather, they need to stay in their lane, both the colonists and the women, right? And if the colonists can't even control their women, then this is a big problem. Colonists need the protection and the leadership of the king. Excellent, Peggy. Yes, they need the king. They need this patriarchal figure to keep control, to keep order over this sort of hedonistic society that's coming up. And the coverture comes from British law, and the colonists are acting illegally, Liana says. Good, excellent. So despite coverture and despite backlash from the British, American women did sort of stand up, speak out, and participate in a lot of different ways. Mark says, these colonists aren't British ladies. But the fact that they did have access to publishing in a newspaper does tell us something about their status in society, right? These are probably not lower class, working class people. They are probably middle and upper class. They're probably relatively well educated. Their husbands are participating in the politics of the moment. So it is indicative of the fact that there were upper class men and women who were participating against the British in the Revolution, as, of course, as we know, see the Founding Fathers. But white women and women of some privilege were certainly not the only women to outwardly participate. So let's take a look at this image. This is an example of a woman who I think will be more familiar to many of us. Mitch says, separating from England might create a real revolution where women and African Americans might demand more, even equal rights. Mitch, what a great segue. Thank you. So let's take a look here. Let's do a really quick observation and interpretation. What is a detail that you see? What's something that you notice, something you might circle? And what might it tell us? What does it make us think about this image that we're looking at? What's the detail that you notice, and what does it make you think when you look at this image? Okay, Malia says educated. Yeah, so that's our interpretation. My guess is the observation that that's based on is she's got a book here, she's got a quill and ink, she's writing. Yeah, so she's an educated person. Her title identifies her as a servant. Good, so that's a little bit of a contradiction in colonial America, that there is a well-educated person who's also a servant. Let's see. An educated servant who can think. She's refined and educated. There's some literacy among Black women. Yes, this is a Black woman. It says a Negro servant, right? She strikes a thoughtful pose, excellent, which tells us that not only is she educated, but perhaps, you know, it's not just that she's literate, but that she is thoughtful and insightful. Excellent. So Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston. All right, so what does that tell us about her? Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston. Whoops. Her last name, same as her master, indicating she belongs. Excellent, Michael. How many Black women had portraits made? Yeah, the fact that this likeness of her exists is indicative of that she is somehow important. She's somehow an important figure, that somebody took the time and the treasure to create this. She's identified by her male owner. Yeah, so how does this sort of, well, how do I want to put this? So it says Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley. Excellent. Kathy says she uses the word, they use the word servant instead of slave. Yes. So Phyllis Wheatley was enslaved by Mr. John Wheatley, therefore has his last name. She was born in West Africa and endured the Middle Passage, was enslaved by the Wheatley family. They named her Phyllis after the slave ship that brought her over the Atlantic on that traumatic journey. Wasn't it illegal for Black people to receive an education? In Massachusetts at this time, I'm not sure that that had been codified. I'm not 100% sure though, so Penelope will have to look that up. Unless somebody knows, please put it in the chat. But the Wheatleys did teach Phyllis to read and to write. So would coverture have applied to Phyllis Wheatley as an enslaved woman? Would she have sort of fallen under coverture? Yeah, Liana, we sometimes forget slavery existed. It absolutely did, even in Massachusetts. She was property, yes. So as property, coverture didn't apply to her. She was owned, she was a thing. But the way that it did apply to her was she was owned by Mr. John Wheatley as representative of that entire family. Phyllis Wheatley, as many of us know, does eventually earn her freedom through her own wherewithal. And so then she is a free woman in the United States, so then coverture does apply to her. And when she marries in 1773, of course, her property becomes that of her husband. Slavery wasn't officially ended, Kathy says, until 1784. We're going to learn more about that in just a minute. Okay, so Phyllis Wheatley writes this poem in 1773. And you know, she is a smart, intelligent, educated woman living in Massachusetts where the revolution is happening all around her, in 1778, not 1773. So the war is happening. And she writes this poem in a letter to a friend of her, a white woman, whose husband, General Worcester, has recently been killed in action on the side of the Patriots. And so we're going to read this poem. And as we're reading, I want us to think about what is Phyllis's message and what is she saying about the revolution and about slavery. So, it's my slam poetry moment. All right, so Phyllis says, we're thinking about what is she saying about the revolution and about slavery. Says, oh, still propitious be thy guardian care, and lead Columbia through the toils of war. With thine own hand conduct them and defend, and bring the dreadful contest to an end. Forever grateful let them live to thee, and keep them ever virtuous, brave, and free. But how, presumptuous, shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the Almighty mind, while yet, O deed ungenerous, they disgrace and hold in bondage Africa's blameless race. Let virtue reign, and those accord our prayers, be victory ours, and generous freedom theirs. So what's she saying about the revolution and about slavery? So, Christine, she's pointing out the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom while holding slaves. Excellent. Penelope, I forget the time when the stories and roots happened. Remember, the slaves in it were not allowed to learn to read and write. So laws, Penelope, laws about teaching enslaved people to read and write, literacy, depends on the different state and the different time period. And so again, I'm not 100% positive, but I don't think those laws were passed in Massachusetts because we see them happening a little bit later in most places in American history, but we can look it up in the break and I will get back to you. Okie doke. So let there be freedom all around. Right. So she's saying she supports the revolution and wants it to succeed, but wants it to expand its goals. Excellent. Yeah. So first, America should win the revolution, free itself from the bondage of the British Empire. But that revolution will not be complete if it doesn't result in an end to slavery in this land founded on freedom and liberty. Excellent. So Phyllis Wheatley was certainly not alone in this interpretation and this calling out of the hypocrisy of the revolution, while many revolutionaries and the so-called founding fathers were in fact slaveholders. And she was part of a larger community of Black colonials and white Americans who were invested in taking this really powerful rhetoric forward and applying it more universally to include an end to slavery. So we're going to take a look at Elizabeth Freeman. So Kathy sort of teed this up for me. So we're going to take a look at Elizabeth Freeman. As I said, we do these life stories in WHAMs. They are short biographies of different women. So we have a written life story of Elizabeth Freeman. We're not going to take the time to read it right now, but we have, over the past year, gone through a project of creating a small series of different animated videos based on a selection of our life stories. So we're going to watch the Elizabeth Freeman life story video to get us to think about the issues that Phyllis Wheatley has raised in her poem in 1778 and how, in the case of Elizabeth Freeman, that really played out. So as we watch this, which we'll do really quickly so that we can go into breakout rooms, but can't not talk about Elizabeth Freeman. As we watch this short video, it's about 2.5 minutes, think about what was the basis of Elizabeth's court case and why was this a persuasive argument in Massachusetts in 1781? Why did Elizabeth's lawyer believe it was necessary to add a man to her court case? And why is Elizabeth's trial important in the history of the American Revolution and in American history generally? So I know that's a lot. Let's really focus on that first one. What's the basis of her court case and why was it a persuasive argument in Massachusetts in 1781? So we'll give this a quick watch and then we will head into our breakout rooms.
Elizabeth Freeman played a critical role in the fight to end slavery in the United States. Elizabeth was born into slavery around 1744. When she was very young, she and her sister were sent to Sheffield, Massachusetts, to work as domestic servants for Hannah and John Ashley. Elizabeth's life with the Ashleys was far from easy. She did all the hard labor necessary to keep the home running. Hannah was violent. She once hit Elizabeth with a hot coal shovel, scarring her for life. In 1765, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl. She named her daughter Elizabeth. Little Elizabeth was also enslaved by the Ashley family. John Ashley became a prominent patriot during the American Revolution. He frequently met with other patriots to discuss the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality for all. Like many enslaved people in the colonies, Elizabeth wondered whether these ideals applied to her. In the summer of 1780, Elizabeth attended a reading of the new Massachusetts state constitution. The first article read, "All men are born free and equal." Elizabeth knew it was time to fight for her freedom. She asked lawyer Theodore Sedgwick to represent her in court. Theodore worried that focusing the case on a single woman wouldn't work because women did not have many rights under the new government. So he added Brom, an enslaved man from the Ashley household, to the case. In court, Theodore argued that because the state constitution stated that all men were born free and equal, enslaving Elizabeth and Brom was unconstitutional. The court agreed and granted Elizabeth and Brom their freedom. Elizabeth's case was used as a precedent for the total abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in 1783. To celebrate her new status, Elizabeth took the last name Freeman and accepted a paid job as a domestic servant for Theodore Sedgwick. Elizabeth used her earnings to buy her own home and land, where she lived with her daughter until she died in 1828. Elizabeth's intelligence and determination won a crucial victory in the fight to end slavery in the new United States of America.
Let's finish this section. It's such an important thing before we move on to the breakout session. Yeah.
Right. I agree, Mitch. Okay, so I hope that that was a useful video for all of you. So let's return to these questions, and we'll do it pretty quickly, and then you can talk more about them in your breakout rooms. But to start with, let's go back to question 1. What was the basis of Elizabeth's court case? So basically, what's the argument, and why was it persuasive in Massachusetts in 1781? What do we think? What was the basis of her case? Terry, yeah, the new Massachusetts state constitution, not the federal constitution, but the Massachusetts state constitution, which is a legal document, right? So what's interesting about this is before the ratification of the US Constitution, but of course after the Declaration of Independence. And what they do in Massachusetts is they actually take a lot of the rhetoric from the Declaration of Independence, which is much more expansive than what we wind up with in the federal Constitution. They take a lot of that rhetoric and put it in the Constitution, which makes it law. The Declaration of Independence is not really a law. It's not the law of the land anywhere. It's just a declaration. It's a list of grievances about why we should have a revolution. But yes, exactly, Terry. Declaration didn't have the force of law, but the Massachusetts Constitution did. So by putting in the Massachusetts Constitution, all men are born free and equal, it's the force of law, exactly. And so Elizabeth is a member of the community and hears all of this colonial rhetoric, takes it, exercises her agency, goes and hears a reading of the Massachusetts State's Constitution and says, I am a human, I was born, therefore I should be free and equal, takes that case to court. Why did Elizabeth's lawyer add a man to the case? Liana says, interesting, all men are born free and equal was applied to women as well, which sort of gets at this second question. What do we think? Why did Theodore Sedgwick add the man to the case? Women had no rights. Yeah, excellent. So as I said, coverture was a part of English common law. And during and after, in the British colonies, and then during and after the American Revolution, English common law stood. It still stands and stood in the United States, except for those bits of it that were specifically about the monarchy and are negated in the US Constitution. So coverture, we still live with vestiges of coverture today. And by adding a man, the case couldn't be thrown out just because Elizabeth was a woman. The tragedy is that it wasn't put in the US Constitution. I would agree with you, Michael. So why is Elizabeth's trial important? Why should we all know Elizabeth Freeman's name? First time laws used to defend abolition establishes a precedent and slavery. Excellent. Right, so she's using the law. Here's a woman of color, an enslaved woman, using the letter of the law to challenge her status, earn her freedom, set the path for the abolition of slavery in the state of Massachusetts, and then later in the entire United States. Ooh, boy, people were fighting slavery from the beginning. Excellent, it gives them a voice, 100%. So we've got Phyllis, who is using her tools as a literary genius to spread this message, and then Elizabeth Freeman, who takes it into court and makes it the law. Excellent. All right, so we've gone through a lot, we've covered a lot, but we've also only scratched the surface of all of the stuff that's in WAMS. So we're gonna take some time in breakout rooms to return to our essential questions. I've added 2 more, which are more about sort of classroom application pedagogy. So how can we incorporate more women's perspectives into classroom teaching? Why is it important? What might you modify from these resources and activities for your students? So I am gonna call on Devin and Shannon and Mitch to let us know how much time in the breakout rooms and to send us off.